Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations in each of our hearts be acceptable to you. O Lord, for you are our rock and you are our Redeemer. Amen. A couple of years ago, I was driving at sunset with two of my college-age nieces. We were trying to make it where we were going before dark, but the sunrise was just so beautiful that I kept slowing down. I was the driver, oohing and eyeing, even pulling over and making everybody get off their cell phones and look at the sunset. My nieces informed me that I was acting just like their father, who is my brother. I was in what they called eagle mode. That's when their dad would see an eagle and stop and make everyone else look at it. And more often than not, it's not actually an eagle, it's just a seagull. But they all have to stop what they're doing so their dad can point out the eagle. Well, it turns out I'm a lot like my brother in this. I often stop and try to make other people look at what I'm seeing. Eagle mode. Today is the Transfiguration. We have just heard this gospel story that seems to be out of this world. It's as if God is in eagle mode, trying to get the disciples to see that there is something absolutely amazing going on right before their eyes in the person of Jesus. The story seems out of this world, and in fact it is a little bit out of this world. It's absolutely of this world as it happens to the disciples and Jesus grounded on that mountain. But it's one of these times, one of these rare times in Jesus' life where his divinity shines through stronger than his humanity, although it's not a competition. So often as the disciples encounter Jesus, they have known that they're in the presence of a really exceptional human who also had some godlike qualities. He could heal and he could walk on water. But they were always confused about the nature of this particular man and wondered how it was that he was both an ordinary person with extraordinary qualities. It seems like the disciples, up until this moment, didn't fully grasp that not only was Jesus a man, he was also God, both at the same time. Jesus acted like one of them, like one of us. And he was one of them, one of us. And yet, he is God in a way that none of us is. On the Transfiguration Mountain, this time, the divine aspect of Jesus shone through so powerfully that the disciples heard God's voice, saw people who had been dead for centuries, and could not deny that there was something absolutely unique and special about this Jesus that they'd been walking around this earth with. Even though they didn't seem to know what was happening, and maybe because they didn't seem to know what was happening, they are stopped in their tracks. This was something special. And as often special things are, it was also a little bit scary. They were on a mountaintop, in a cloud, unable to see in front of them or really anywhere around. And there were voices and visions. And so they did these human things. First of all, they tried to solve the vision. They tried to solve this moment they were in, as if there was something for them to do besides just be there. They were in their own form of eagle mode. I know, let's get other people to be able to experience this. We can build some temples here, some houses. And that's not just so that this place will be a place where Jesus will always come to hang out, like some sort of permanent retreat. It's so that other people, when they come up that mountain, would be able to know something special happened here. It's that same instinct when people carve into a tree. It drives me crazy. It's that God was here instinct. And this is what people have done throughout religious history and throughout the history of Israel. They build temples and mark with rocks the places where God has showed up. It makes sense that this would be one of the disciples' responses, so that other people could know on this mountain something extraordinary happened. But in doing that, they get something very wrong, because it's like they want to stay in that mountaintop moment themselves. And their next response is also a very human one. It's to fall to the ground in worship or in fear or in some combination of the two. This is also a very human response to the glory of God. This is beyond eagle mode. This is the kind of terror that can overtake you when you see a wave that is strong and powerful, or you recognize in the night sky just how small you are and how big God is. We are, by our very nature, people who are afraid of mystery and people who want to domesticate wild moments and our wild God. We are, by our very nature, people who need permanent markers in order to find God's presence. The disciples, they have these reactions, and I don't want to criticize them, although so often we do. We paint these disciples as buffoons trying to domesticate God, or as engineers trying to make their building project. And all of that is funny, but it also says something about who we are. We need rituals we can rely on. We need communities that give us stability, sacraments that we can rely on, that we come and meet God. One of the beautiful things about the season that we're about to enter, the season of Lent, is simply that it happens every year. And you don't have to do anything to make it happen. Lent is a church season that comes, and it will come again. And maybe you will be in a season that matches where you are, a season of grief and of mourning, a season of focusing on sin and needing to be reminded of the frailty of the human condition. Or maybe it will be a season that's a mismatch for where you are. That's okay too. We will go through Lent together, and Lent will work. It will carry us forward off of the mountaintop, through the valley, into Easter. Lent works, and then Easter works, because this is how God works. God enters into our mountaintops and into our valleys, into the daily stresses of our lives and the moments when we are filled with glory and awe. And God encounters us. This is what God does. In a book called Way to Live, a high school student described her mountaintop experience. She described this week that she spent on a mission trip. Have you ever been on a mission trip, some sort of week away from the normal patterns of life? Raise your hand if you've had this experience, this kind of mountaintop thing. So this student talked about how much being engaged in service was so important to her spiritual life and to how she met God differently on this trip. Then she says this: on each day, all the different practices that are part of the good life were right there. We ate, we prayed, we worked, we played, we sang together. We didn't worry about what we looked like or wish we had more stuff, because everyone was wearing work clothes and living out of a suitcase. We were surrounded by the community of friends, and somehow all these practices fit together in a rhythm that felt right. Her youth group leader called that rhythm the dance. She wrote, "You feel like you're moving to a beat that comes from someplace deep and true." And then she said it was so hard to come back home. She wanted to get back to the mountaintop, and even though her youth group leader told her she couldn't stay on the mountaintop, she wanted to be there. And what it compelled her to do was to try to figure out how to live in such a way that she didn't need to be on the mountaintop to experience God in everyday life. I think this is where we live too, as disciples of Jesus who occasionally encounter God in the most awe-inspiring, mysterious, miraculous ways, like that transfiguration. but who frankly live most of our lives in the humdrum rhythms of doing dishes and carting people around and caring for our own tired bodies, dragging ourselves to community meetings and to church, and hoping we meet God there too. We live between the mountain and the valley, going back and forth, and sometimes wandering all the way around. We don't live on the mountain, the disciples didn't either. But we don't live permanently in the valley either. And as we enter Lent, that's important for us to keep in mind. Where we live is exactly where God lives. And that is, quite simply, everywhere. Now you might be thinking out there, I believe that, I believe God lives everywhere, but I would like to experience God in that transfiguration way. I wish I could promise that to you. I wish that I could promise that sometime in the near future you will have that experience that the disciples had. But I can't. I know too many people who are longing to encounter God, and yet who are finding that they don't have the experience of God's presence that helps them cultivate the kind of faith they think they would have if they met God in a mountaintop. Only 3 of the disciples were there with Jesus that day. And all the rest never saw the transfigured, glorified God. And that teaches us something too. It teaches us that we don't need to have dramatic encounters with God to trust that God is with us in every moment. I think all we can do is say yes if we're invited to go up a mountain, even if it seems like kind of a scary and treacherous journey, and let go of any expectations for how that will go. I think we can enter into eagle mode. And if somebody invites you in, just say yes. Just put down your cell phone and look at the eagle. We can keep quiet when we have an experience of God that seems so sacred that we ourselves don't understand it. And we can trust God to work in the mystery, in the quiet, in the solace. And we can hold on to the truth that the glory of God is to be found everywhere. Amen.